Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome here from Cape Town, South Africa. I'm told we have people attending from South Africa, from Saudi Arabia, the UK, Canada, the USA, Zimbabwe, Italy, and the Netherlands. So hearty welcome to all of you. I know for some of you it's afternoon, for some of you it's morning. We are very glad that you are joining us, and thank you for your interest. I want in particular to say a warm welcome to the students who are joining us, who participated in this project, and to the storytellers in the book who were so generous throughout the last 4 years with their time and giving of themselves. And of course, I also want to welcome the panelists, and I will introduce you a little bit later in a proper manner. How could creative arts help us to pay attention to the enduring effects of historical trauma in South Africa and elsewhere in the world? This is one of the central questions that concern the work that we do at Stellenbosch University Studies in Historical Trauma and Transformation. And I want to leave as much time as possible this afternoon for the panelists to talk and for a conversation with you, the audience, but I think it is important to provide a little bit of background to the context of today's webinar. It all stems from a book that was published in 2019. These are the things that sit with us. And this book contained 29 stories of research participants who were part of a project that examined the intergenerational effects of apartheid on South Africans in 3 communities just outside of Cape Town, Bonteheuwel, Langa, and Worcester. And while rooted in research, this book was intentionally formatted to appeal to a mainstream book-consuming audience rather than being limited to an academic audience. We were hoping, and that is the editors, Pumla Gobodo-Marikizela, Friederike Bubenzer, and myself, was hoping that the book would provide a space that enabled and sparked the kind of engagement that is necessary for entrenched versions of ourselves to shift. And the next iteration of the book, the website, Through the Eyes of Survivors of Apartheid, was the next iteration of this vision. And we hope that this website, which was launched in September, and if you have not looked at it yet, please do so. Our very capable technical assistant, Unison Muguma, will share the link with you in the chat file. And we were hoping that this website will become a platform to contain an archive of stories that generate creative conversations about violent histories, not just South Africa's, but also globally in contexts where some of my colleagues work in Tanzania, the DRC, Rwanda, Lebanon, Russia, and among immigrant communities in the UK. The current digital exhibition with images, voice recordings of the storytellers themselves, and recordings of their stories in 3 languages set the tone for the space. And today, with this webinar, we see the first culmination of this platform as a space for engagement, as we are now beginning to add the work of 28 students from Stellenbosch University's Visual Arts Department, who responded to the stories through an initiative driven by Dr. Caroline Perold-Bull, who are also a panelist with us today. Their work explores the intergenerational dynamic of apartheid trauma, another central question to the work that we do. For this project, Caroline assigned the stories in the book to the 3rd-year students in visual communication design. The brief to the students was to illustrate an abstract comic representing a personal response to the story assigned to them, and then to expand this narrative further in the form of animation. In interviews with the students to get a better understanding of their creative engagement with the stories and the storytellers and how this opened up spaces for change, one of the students, Bryony Tregus, said this, and I'm quoting her now. The stories in this book forced me to think about how I engage or disengage with what is going on around me. The choice to engage becomes part of my privilege. Terence Makubalu does not have that choice. What would it look like if I chose to engage on a daily basis as an active act against oblivion? Please look at Bryony's contribution on the website. It is thought-provoking and I think represents a deeply thoughtful engagement with a troubling past. Terence Makubalu is the story that she responded to, and it tells the story of Terence as a young activist during the student protests, and he still have bullets lodged in his head, 17. It's quite dramatic. He has the X-ray, and there's a photograph of the X-ray that he presented to the TRC in the hearings then. A very engaging story, and I think the way that these two conversations come together is really what we had in mind. So I thought that this matter of engagement and disengagement and the possibilities for the arts to engage people in difficult conversations that may help us work with and hopefully also eventually through violent and traumatic histories is important. And at this point, I just need to, and I want to acknowledge Professor Phumla Gobodo-Madikizela. She is unable to join us today, but she has really been instrumental in this work as the research leader of the project that I referred to. And she also leads the work at Studies in Historical Trauma and Transformation as the Saatchi Chair in Violent Histories and Transgenerational Trauma. She is currently on sabbatical at Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. As the Walter Jackson Bate Fellow there, she will be working for the next few months on the topic Aesthetics of Memory, Narratives of Repair. And I think this conversation today speaks of her vision behind this project. She is indeed the driving force for our thinking about the possibilities of creative forms to change us in how we relate to one another as human beings. And I wish her all the best for a productive time in writing and of thinking. So with me today to help us think through all of this are three panelists who are all immersed in the arts, and they have something in common that all three of them also teach. They represent different art forms, come from different contexts, and that I think will make for an interesting conversation. Let me start with you, Caroline. Dr. Caroline Perel-Bull is a lecturer and coordinator of the Visual Communication Design Division in the Visual Arts Department at Stellenbosch University. Her focus lies in design, thinking, typographic, information, and experience design, and navigating the dynamic relationships between these fields and design philosophy and theory. She is especially interested in design for productive future change. In her research, she explores design from post-human, new materialist perspectives. Her PhD focused on design education within the context of transformation and decolonization in South African higher education. Dr. Thembinkosi Goniwe is an artist and art historian, now lecturing at Rhodes University. He makes art, writes essays, and curates exhibitions locally and internationally. Goniwe holds an MFA from the University of Cape Town, an MA and a PhD in art history from Cornell University. Last, but certainly not least, I want to welcome Professor John Edwin Mason, who joins us right at the start of his day from Charlottesville in Virginia, where he teaches African history and the history of photography in the Corcoran Department of History. I hope I pronounced that correctly, John. Here he co-directs the university's Holsinger Portrait Project, a multimedia initiative which explores the neglected history of Black Virginians through studio portraits of them that were made a century ago. His work in progress, a book about the 20th century African-American photographer, writer, and filmmaker Gordon Parks, will be the first extended analysis of Parks's crucial Life magazine photo essays on race and poverty. Mason has published 2 books on South African history: Social Death and Resurrection, Slavery and Emancipation in South Africa, and One Love Guma Beat, Inside the Cape Town Carnival, in which he brought together history, ethnography, and his own documentary photographs. He earned his BA from the University of Cincinnati and his MA, MPhil, and PhD from Yale University. Welcome to all 3 of you. I have neglected to say in the beginning, Unison asked me very nicely to make some to announce some house rules, although they are not quite rules, but he asked me to ask the people in the audience to make sure that you post your comments and make remarks in the chat file, and that you put your questions in the Q&A file that you would see at the bottom of the screen. If you can, please also introduce yourself in the chat file. It is wonderful to see who is with us this afternoon. So let's start with this matter of engaging and disengaging. And I thought, John, that I wanted to start with you. You are based in the US, and yet you have chosen to engage with South Africa and issues of social justice here. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how that happened, why you did it, and not just sort of in abstract terms with a country, but with the lived experience of people here. Could you tell us a little bit about that engagement?
Sure. It's a long story, and I'll try to make it a short story. I arrived in South Africa at the very beginning of 1989, and I left South Africa in late 1990. And those of us who are old enough to remember those 2 years remember how transformational they were. Arriving in 1990, I came in the midst of a very, very bleak time in South African history. Apartheid was at its height. 30,000 people were in detention. We know now that many of them were being physically abused and tortured. Death squads were active in the townships. Almost every day there were running battles between the youth with rocks and the police with bullets. Repression was in the air everywhere. I was in Cape Town and was constantly aware of what was happening in the Cape Flats, even though I wasn't living in the Cape Flats. But you know, you can see the Cape Flats if you happen to be, say, in Wynberg, which is where I was staying. You could see the smoke rising from the tire barricades that the youth, the comrades, would set up. And of course, by the time I left South Africa, Nelson Mandela was out of jail. The political prisoners had been freed. The liberation organizations had all been unbanned, and that difficult process of negotiations had begun. It was a very different country by the time I left. It was a remarkable time to be here. I was here because I wanted to study the United States, and I wanted to study the United States sort of through a mirror. You know, I'd become aware of South Africa as a high school student in the 1970s. I'd become aware of South Africa because the Soweto uprising was in the news. You know, you saw it on your television set and you read about it in your newspaper, and it was something that resonated because, you know, the United States had just come through the civil rights and Black Power era and had come through the period of the urban uprisings in the United States of the 1960s. And so what was happening in Soweto resonated. I mean, it was an uprising against racial oppression in the same way that Black Americans had been rising up. And the few years after the Soweto uprising, Steve Biko became a name that many people knew in the United States. Sadly, after his murder by the police, but his writing circulated, and other Black consciousness writing circulated, and they resonated so strongly with Black Americans and with progressive Americans because so many of the ideas parallel the ideas of Black power in the United States, and of course anti-colonial writing around the world, because the issues were so similar. Now I got to college and I took a class in British imperial history, and the most interesting part of British imperial history to me was South Africa, because it seems so familiar. I mean, here was a settler colony that had been formed on the basis of the genocidal wars against, well, not quite genocide, but wars against the native inhabitants, that their land had been taken by conquest and they had been pushed off to what in America we call reservations, and over here they were called native reserves. It was also a colony that had been formed on the basis of racial slavery, the Cape Colony, and that all seems so familiar because, of course, the United States is a settler colony. The United States acquired its land by taking it from Native Americans, that the basis of the American economy until the 1860s was racial slavery. I mean, there was so much in common, and then after slavery and conquest in both countries comes this period of severe racial oppression and exploitation. And parallel to that are the freedom struggles, the resistance movements. And, you know, I said, wow, this is like American history, only different. And I bet if I go to South Africa and learn about South Africa, I'm going to learn about the United States. And so I came here, I was doing my thesis research, 1989, 1990. And I taught for one term at what was then the University of Natal, Durban. And like so many people who come to South Africa, I fell in love with the place, and I fell in love with the people, and I fell in love with the food and the music, and that encouraged me to, you know, turn my thesis into a book, and then return to work on the carnival for 4 years with the Pennsylvanians of Hanover Park. I was a member, I marched with them, I had the kit and everything. So yeah, my connection to South Africa is long and deep, and I'm really grateful to be asked to participate in this, because even though my focus is now on African American history, the question of trauma and the question of intergenerational trauma is something that both of these nations also share. You know, African Americans have been through slavery, segregation, oppression, and as I know you know, we're still subject to arbitrary murder at the hands of the police. And you saw the protest all our summer, your winter, but all summer long here were the protests. And that's a response to trauma. And, you know, we can talk about the other kinds of responses to trauma. And it's both trauma that is experienced in the here and now, and it's trauma that is intergenerational. And, you know, I've been thinking as well about the various responses to trauma. And some of them are quite bad, you know, quite damaging responses. Violence and alcoholism, to name just two, drugs, gangs. But of course, there are many other responses. And I'm now writing a book about somebody who turned his trauma into art. This photographer, writer, and filmmaker called Gordon Parks, very significant figure in mid-20th century America. And very much he was so aware of the intergenerational trauma that he had inherited, but he found ways of turning that into a real important creative impulse. So I've switched to American history. I apologize for that, but my connection with South Africa, I was there for 5 weeks last year, and just renewing my friendships and my relationships, and yeah. I hope that answered your, yeah.
It did, thank you. And I want to go to Tim Nkosi. You, in a journal article, you talked about art as a space, and I'm quoting you now, as a space in itself. It is a site in, through, and with which artists negotiate ideas and produce meaning in their engagement with the world. In what John has just described, there were a few sort of sites, mediating and navigating sites that he mentioned. One that's close to my heart was the media. When he talks about newspapers, it was in the news. And in that way, that formed a basis for relationships, but also the music and other things, food. So I'm wondering if you could tell us more about your idea about art as this site in which to negotiate ideas.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you for my colleagues and for the invitation from the Institute and all of those who've made time to come here. It's the question you're asking me, it's complex, but I'll try to find ways in which I could simplify in a short space of time. I think John has mapped out a number of things, how he has moved from one space to another, how he has engaged with people, how he has written histories, how South Africa has helped him to study and understand America much better. You know, I mean, if you think in those movements, already John is talking about navigating space. We have a tendency to look at art as these objects that stand outside us, or something that we go to the gallery or to the museum to look at. And I mean, my thinking about art as a space is just to rethink that, so that we understand art as not something that we must always look at, something that we inhabit, we move into, right? That we become part of. It becomes a space in which we are embedded in, that we are immersed in, that we embody in one way or another. And performance artists, they do that very well, right? And musicians, they do that very well because the sound travels, permit space, they cross, you know, walls, boundaries, and so forth. The same could be thought about visual arts, even with two-dimensional images, because once you look at them, we already enter into those spaces, because what artists manage to do is to open up avenues, to help us think through, to travel through. So those moments, they help us to reflect, to engage, but also to be disturbed at times, right? To be forced to think differently. You know, some artists, what they will do, they will take an object, distort it, or present it in a different way that we are not expecting. That very moment of that shift, it makes us see things differently. That's how art affects us. So this is what I mean by being in the space, within that space. And artists are good at doing that. By artists, I'm not referring only to visual arts, as John has talked about Gordon Parks, the great diverse photographer and filmmaker and others, but also we are talking about art in different registers, in different mediums, whether be musicians, whether be performance art, be visual artists. We're also talking about writers, you know, of novels. And the beauty in which they do so is that they create new worlds or different worlds from those we know. But usually they start from the familiar and they take us to the strange. So it is these spaces that I'm talking about that we enter, right? And for me, it is when we enter those spaces that we are able to be affected, as well as to affect both the artwork and its maker, that is the artist. So that's what I mean by you know, this space, to see art as a site. To extend that idea of art as a space, this works more easily when you curate, because when you curate, you're not only arranging objects on walls, but we are arranging object in space. We are affecting space, like architecture. Architecture is about space. And one of the things apartheid was able to do very well, I'll quote the later David Kolwane, where he said apartheid was about space, a contestation of space. And to make artists to reclaim space is to ask us to think differently about the way in which space is. Yes, during apartheid, you might have not have means to fight, in the beginning, physically, to act, to react, to subvert, to transgress apartheid physically or with machinery, with guns and so forth. But one of the things artists did was to work with this symbolic forms, with these metaphoric forms, whereby they were forcing us to say, no, it's possible to subvert things. It's possible to claim spaces, as David would say, right? It's possible to ask, what art can do to shift mind. Otherwise, why would most of the literature, I'm talking about creative literature, why most of the art was banned? Because apartheid knew the power of that space to affect people, to conscientize people. Of course, artists, even those who were banned, those who were arrested, even those who were killed, the likes of Tamimiel, what we are left with is the spaces they created for us. One spaces are the artworks, but also the kind of spaces they organize. If in the case of Tamimiel, for example, when he was in Botswana, the Maybe Ensemble, they created posters that were sent back to South Africa and distributed around the world to promote the struggle, right? But also there were also artists within South Africa who were like working with spaces, whether those were community art spaces or those were like joint initiatives, ranging from people's personal homes and so forth. So when we talk about District 6, we are also talking about space, in particular the stories that are coming out, beautiful stories that people are telling. The more you listen to those stories, you start to see the space. It's about this contested space. We can stretch that space also to say it's about the land that people are trying to reclaim. People were moved, not from Mars, from certain spaces. That's what apartheid was good at doing. So in other words, art claims that space, both for me, literally and symbolically, whether it's installations or whether it's images that moves, or it's sounds and so forth. That's what I was trying to explain in that project when we were working with the idea of space and pace. I hope I've answered your question, Mariana. The last thing I would say also in terms of engagement is that perhaps what we should be thinking about is how do we also rethink, I'm saying this to rethink the idea of not only art, the way in which we listen to historical stories, especially traumatic stories. As I was going through the book, listening to those stories and also looking at the beautiful artworks that students made, two things came to me. Is also to find ways in which we learn, also we unlearn the way in which we look at things, the way we listen to these stories. It's no longer about us telling. By us, I mean those who are in the knowing or those are scholars, intellectual, you name them. Is to listen to ordinary people talking about ordinary life, the everyday. Because the beauty of these stories, these are everyday stories. And once you make these things every day, you open them up. By opening them up, you allow a sense of understanding, right? And by understanding, then what we are compelling is us to find new ways of listening, new ways of looking. Because what we tend to do as scholars or as intellectuals is always to look at or speak to, not to speak with. In other words, art as a space and this kind of forum should be a dialogue whereby we exchange. I'll stop there for now.
I like very much what you said about space, art as a space, and because it somehow I then have that image in my head that one can then move from one space to another. And I want to go to Caroline, but because Caroline and I interviewed the students together, but Caroline were the driving force behind this art project. But what struck me was that most of the stories in the book are stories about Black people's experiences. Most of the students in the third year class are white students. And I wonder, Caroline, you also as a white South African, and thinking of what the students said about privilege, engagement, disengagement, their sense and their feelings of guilt and sadness and anger about what they saw in the stories. I wonder, how would you describe what seems to me, well, judging from your academic interest and how passionate you were about this project and from the work you do with the students, how do you, and why would you, what would you ascribe this choice that you have seemed to make to engage, to work in an engaged way?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And also, like the others have said, thank you for the opportunity. I am very aware that I am a white South African woman and that I come from a privileged position. Also then specifically within this context of Stellenbosch University, and you've described the demographic of the class that partook in this project as well. And that awareness is something that stays with one, with me in particular, in a constant way. It's not something that goes away. And I'm also aware that this, to a great extent, it's almost like I feel as a white South African, one represents within the context of Stellenbosch University, to a certain extent, one represents that which is in fact resisting transformation to some degree. I believe very strongly that productive change is necessary in the context of South Africa in general, but specifically in its higher education context. So yes, I do choose to engage. It's a conscious choice. And I feel that to make this choice is actually the easy part. And perhaps here is a link that I could make to what, Temikosi, to what you've been saying, is that the link to the everyday, to practice this choice on an everyday, in an everyday way, on a daily, consistent basis. That's what's much more difficult than actually making the choice. It's not a once-off thing. It's something that I think must happen consistently as one engages with the context that you find yourself in. In terms of my choice to engage, I think I could perhaps say that something that I've realized is that I think it's very necessary to have to keep your eye on the big picture, if I can put it that way. But I think more importantly, I've learned that it helps me to focus on the local and specific. So to try and tune myself into the waves that are kind of rolling around me, and to try and feel that, also making a link, I guess, to the embodiment that was already mentioned in the discussion. And then to try and respond to it through that which I in any case do on an everyday basis. So in my case, within this context of the university context where I find myself at the moment, that is to respond to what I feel happening around me through my position as and I regard myself as a designer, artist / researcher / teacher. All of those things function in an entangled kind of way. So I feel that I need to teach through doing research, through practicing art, all at the same kind of time. Identifying with being a designer, I would say I approach my teaching as art, as a design kind of project. How can I, that's my practice as an artist and designer as well. And my hope would be that just by trying to stay tuned to this and using my everyday life, reminding myself of the context I find myself in daily, that little by little, some form of change can happen. Yeah, I hope that addresses the question you asked also. think you're on mute, Marietjie.
Thank you. That you make it something that is about practice, and that it is also an embodied thing, and that it is a choice. I really appreciate that. I want to move on to a next, hopefully not unrelated segment of this conversation, and that is about platforms like the website and the book and other platforms that you've talked about, and its potential for being starting points for important and difficult conversations about violent histories. And I want to start with you, Caroline, and ask you if you could say something about what you heard the students say about how the creative process, how the working with the stories over a long period help them to work with their responses of being angry and sad and overwhelmed and outraged. And I'm using words that they were using. And what did you hear the students say about the effect of their creative work with the story, and how it provided entry points for them to have conversations beyond that of themselves and the storyteller?
Yeah, I think that's really, for me, that's what intrigues me most about this process, is that creative kind of process and the role it plays in creating space for greater conversations between oneself and others, but I think also between oneself and oneself, if I can put it that way. I think there are a few things that stand out to me. The fact that the stories were told by individuals in the first person and exists in 3 different languages in the book. That was touched on by many students in their responses and in our discussions throughout the course of the projects. Many commented on the fact that through all their years of schooling, this was the first time that they were actually faced with South Africa's apartheid past in such a real kind of way. It does seem as if the stories themselves seem to break some of the boundaries that perhaps one could say formal education or curricula or formal academic or institutional kind of structures often seem to impose on history. Yeah, and 2 things stood out from their experiences, specifically with regard to the creative process. Firstly, quite a few commented on the fact that working through a process in reaction to the story seemed to allow them to take time to actually engage with their own emotional responses and with that of others through the stories that were told. So that notion of time, and where something would perhaps under normal circumstances, you would hear it, you would respond, and it would pass you by. It's as if the process created a different kind of sense of time, which I think perhaps also linked to art as a space. So it's creating a different kind of time-space dimension to a certain extent. And secondly, it was also mentioned that the creative process, in a sense, allowed for things that were inside of them to somehow get out for the first time. And sometimes it wasn't necessarily things that they were aware of that what were inside, but then through the process, it kind of gained a presence in a more external kind of way. So I think what might perhaps help at this stage is to also give a bit of background just regarding some of the details of the 2 projects. Marietjie, you mentioned that I facilitated a project. It was a 2-part process. First, the kind of abstract comic, and that was facilitated by me. And then a colleague of mine, Mika Hall, took the project further, and she facilitated a second kind of response through animated kind of form. So in the first part of the project, the abstract comic part, perhaps I can start with what an abstract comic is. An abstract comic is a comic, but it functions in predominantly abstract form. So it focuses on the communicative power of basic visual elements like color and line and scale and space to create a sense of a sequential drive or a storyline. And the creative process in this part of the project involved a process of physically translating emotional responses to the stories that each student dealt with through a range of media. And the media wasn't prescriptive, it was open, so students could explore whatever media they had available. Many worked with charcoal, some worked with paint, some worked with cutting and tearing things up, some started working with needle and thread, scratching. And then as a second part of the process, they had to start thinking about, now that these kind of raw visual elements exist in physical form, how could you rearrange it and play with it, and arrange it in relation to each other so that some form of narrative can start to emerge. And then during the second part of the project, they had to kind of take this, the comic further, but they were advised to not just take the comic and make an animation of it, but to really see it as a second round of response. And because of the medium being animated form, time and movement and sound were added to the BICs, which didn't necessarily come into play in the initial part of the process. So in summary, I think one could perhaps say that the iterative but also material translation process of the creative process provided time and space, a different kind of time and space to work through difficult emotions. And here comes the embodied concept again, to work through it in an embodied way. So it's a thinking and a feeling way. It's not just a thinking with your head, but it's bringing the mind and the body together in a way. And I think as a last thing, I would also like to add, I think the follow-up conversations that you and I had with the students after the projects were long completed as part of the kind of curriculum, I think those were also very valuable. And I think part of its value lay in the fact that it existed outside of the curriculum. It came after the fact. There wasn't any pressure of assessment or achieving certain skills or anything that is often associated with a more formal academic context. So I think that I would want to kind of almost merge into the whole larger creative process as well, because I think that was also quite a valuable part of the process. Mute again.
Thank you. Thembinkosi, I want to go to you because I think we will talk again about curriculum and teaching, but this was very helpful, Caroline, because I think the thing that I remember as well was it, and the one thing that in terms of creating platforms for useful and productive and constructive dialogue, the one thing that stays with me is this thing that all of them said, it was about time. And we often think that we can organize one meeting or one dialogue platform and all our problems will be solved. But it struck me from this engagement with the art, between the stories and the art forms, that time is an important thing. And I want to go to you, Thembinkosi, in this same journal article that I referred to earlier, especially when we think of dialogue as a once-off thing that can happen in an hour, I think it is so dangerous what you talk about, that whole thing that we often still see each other in reductionist ways in this diverse country of ours. And you talk about, you warn against the portrayal of or representation of the African experience as one, and I quote, through which ideas, experiences, and aspirations of Africans are always already circumscribed by the catastrophic burden of Africa's history of imperialism and colonialism, as well as post-colonial wars, battles, genocides, and the corruption of African leaders, as if there are no other ideals and experiences that define and shape the contemporary identities and aspirations of Africans. And I want to ask, in curating creative platforms for generate dialogue and conversation about what is clearly a history steeped in burden and catastrophe, how do we avoid that kind of reductionist dialogue? One in which the perpetrators feel paralyzed by guilt and the victims remain shackled by this one-dimensional representation. How do we get beyond that?
Thank you again. You're asking me like complex questions. I feel tasked. Let me think quickly. That comment, it's a response to this overburdening, this constant overload that African, in that context, we're speaking artists, African artists, in fact, Black artists, that they have to carry a burden of always speaking about trauma, problems, and all of that, as if the everyday experience, which they go through, which they live, which they invent, has no moment, there are no moments of joy, of beauty, as if we don't kiss, we don't laugh, we don't hug, as if we are born only out of rape, as if our parents, as if, they didn't walk love corners, they didn't stand in a corner of a shadow, they didn't make, so, and this you see also in most movies when it comes to African experience. And John will help me. One of the things I've learned when I was in the US, there were 3 images that you see of Africa, is the poverty, the feminine, and all of that. The other one are these genocides, the thingy. And the 3rd image is the beauty without people, where it's selling for tourists. You don't see Africans dressed beautifully, enjoying dinner, sitting with kids, intellectualizing. We don't see life at the university. That's American TV. I'm talking about the popular culture. Right, so I asked, no, man, where I come from, of course, as we know, South Africa for a long time has been divorced from Africa as if we are not. But once we start to cross these boundaries, you'll find even in the most struggling settings, people are living, people are doing things, people are making life. And these are the stories that at times are not given attention to, or even when artists are invited or commissioned, they are not asked to look at these so-called non-violent, non-poverty, non-trouble, non-problematic. So the burden now becomes, this reproduction of what we call it in Achille Mbembe's notion of the negative interpretation of Africa. Some have called it Afro-pessimists or so forth and so forth. So what I was asking in that project, which also I'll touch a bit in what Karen was saying in terms of, there are other things. And art as a space, art as a site, it should be dynamic. In fact, it should be multi-layered. We cannot reduce it because our lives are not flat. Our lives are not simple. We are all complex in our different ways. We occupy different times at different places. So why not, cannot art do that or engage that? Even force us to think in that way, to feel that way. And one of the things that art does, when you look at carefully, whether it's an abstract art, it forces us out of the so-called dominant narratives. That's why, for those who read art history, when artists are, I don't believe in this idea of avant-garde forerunners. I only see those artists as innovative, to ask us to think differently, to force us to think of time, to change time, because time is a process and you are usually inside time. And to say to us, we have lived this moment. We have to create a moment that we have to inhabit. We cannot wait for that moment to tell us what to be. Let's meet it, let's make it. That's what imagination is about, is to create future. And artists, they do that very well, similar to scientists. Because scientists, they create things that they become useful, even if to some extent or greater extent they become harmful, but the speed at which now we travel, who have said we'll be speaking like this, is because of the vision, right? It's because of this imagination. And art does that. And I see no reason why in the life of the everyday, we cannot do that. In the life of difference, we cannot do that. It is that, So again, perhaps what we need to ask is to think about art as these platforms, these different levels, these layers in which we inhabit, because our lives, like, you know, you start from infancy, you grow, you learn to walk, you learn to talk, you know what I mean? Art should do all of that, you know, from being born until those last moments. It should be complex as the way life is. You know what I mean? That's what I was trying to say in that. Perhaps another two points I would like to add. You know what I mean? When you were asking what this platform should be, what is the potential? The potential of art, for me, I'll simplify, I'll summarize. I said that one I've mentioned is the question of innovation or imagination. That's where art really should invest. And to do so, artists should be freed, should be allowed, should not be told what to do. They should not be instrumentalized. You know what I mean? Of course, we can commission them to ask us to think, but even in those instances, they should be allowed, because it is out of this space of free willing that they could be able to make accidents, to create things that are not expected. But once you program them, you stifle them, right? You contain them. But once you allow them to experiment, to test, to agitate us, to remind us of beautiful things, of ugly things, you know, to spit in our face, you know what I mean? That forces us to engage. And art for me becomes an engagement, becomes this platform with the potential you are asking. The other one, you know, I mean, I've already touched on, is that art should also not only be that which we go and sit in a gallery. We should move from that. The beauty of contemporary art has been to force art into the everyday. That's why some people will go to gallery and look at contemporary art and say, I can do it because it looks like a child. Like, that's the very moment of shifting, because it opens it up. It says, collapse this institutionalization of these hierarchies. You know what I mean? Of course, then we come with our language, our discourses, and then we keep on closing it. You know, whereas artists, they keep on opening it up. I think that is important, because once you do that, we are forcing us to think differently. We are opening us to say, I can do it, you can do it, we can do it. You know what I mean? So I think that's where art has a potential to collapse these boundaries or these borders, which are hierarchical, and create these differences that always, you know, become binary. So back to what I was saying earlier, art should be a space of dialogue. And once this platform, they begin to be an engaging, ways of engaging, that's where once we start to speak to each other, to listen to each other, to pay attention to how we feel and how we understand, you know, I mean, that's where we are going to be able then to plan, to think, to engage. Because what apartheid has done very well and effectively is not only to create this apartness and hate, is to institutionalize and break it and make sure that we never interact, we never cross borders. We don't understand that I have your blood, you have my blood, right? It makes clear that. And then we are so institutionalized into these pockets. Even those who tried, we're always reminded, when you cross the border, you're like, oh shit, where am I at? You are still, you know what I mean? Sometimes we need to dive. Art should piece to us, should force us. You know, I mean, that's what I'm thinking as platform. I hope I'm answering your question.
Yes, definitely. And I think what you describe is, there are so many important points there, but the thing about the possibility of, or how we should get away from also this division between, there are people who are interested in art and there are people who are not interested in art, because art is this exclusive special thing somewhere in art galleries. And I also like your idea about the ability of art to change time, because I think that's something we also, that I at least also heard in what the students were saying, that it collapsed that time. They thought of apartheid as that thing of the past, and it brought it home. So it changed that time. John, I want to get to you because—
Yeah, before you ask the question though, I want to respond to something that Tim Nkosi just said. And I think it's really on point. It's that the way that artists who come from oppressed and marginalized communities feel the burden to address that oppression and marginalization. And it is a burden that, of course, musicians, writers, visual artists talk about and struggle against a lot. And, you know, a few years ago, I was working on a book that never got written about Abdullah Ibrahim, and I was interviewing lots of Cape Town musicians. I must have interviewed 50 Cape Town musicians, everybody except Abdullah Ibrahim. And that's why the book never got written, by the way. But I was talking to Tina Scow, the singer and songwriter, and Tina was saying, we were talking about what happened in 1994, and she said something really interesting about what happened in 1994. 1994 gave her the freedom to write love songs. You know, because before 1994, she felt like she had to write about the struggle in some way. Maybe not directly about the struggle, but her songs had to do with the life of Black South Africans. Apartheid was always lurking in those songs. The condition of Black South Africans was always lurking in those songs. The hope, the fight for a better future was always lurking in those songs. And she said that writing a love song felt so trivial. It felt so trivial. It felt like it was an indulgence, that there were much more important things that she had to be singing about. And in 1994, she lost her muse. And it took her a while for her to give herself permission to write love songs. And, you know, it was not instantaneous in 1994. It took a while for her to give herself permission. I know that's true of photographers. So you think about Paul Weinberg, the photographer and writer. Paul curated a collection of South African photography about 15 years ago. It's a while now. It was called Before and After. So he looked at a selection of South African photographers, himself, Cedric Nunn, David Goldblatt, I can't think of the rest of them. And they submitted portfolios that they had made before 1994 and portfolios of images that they had made after 1994. And in ways that were very similar to Tina Scow, that before 1994, apartheid is always somewhere in the image. You know, it's there, it's lurking, it's a shadow. Sometimes it's directly there. And after 1994, there is not an instant again, but a slow transformation of what they're able to do, and they're able to address other things, the everyday. And this is something I try to do in my teaching all the time, especially when I'm teaching about colonial African history or when I'm teaching about South Africa in particular, is that I don't want my students to believe that everybody was sad and oppressed all the time. I want to remind them that, you know, people told jokes, people fell in love, people danced, people made music, people looked forward to getting drunk on Saturday night. You know, this was all part of life as well. And one of the things that helps me do that is art. And I open class, every class, I open class with a YouTube video. And sometimes it's old South African music, the Jazz Pioneers or something like that, Miriam Makeba, Dolly Ratebe. And sometimes it's hip hop, right? Or sometimes it's house, you know, contemporary, right today. But at least it's always a reminder that there's more to life than apartheid on the one hand and the fist in the air on the other hand. So in any case, Tim, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, well, you've responded to the question, because I wanted to ask about what you wrote about music and using music then as an example of a creative form to negotiate context and identity and the meaning of belonging, and the experiences that you presented us with is such a good answer to that is what Miriam Makeba, this is what Paul Weinberg, this is what the artists who crossed that time from the late 80s, early 90s to beyond 1994 is a negotiation. And again, I think again, perhaps that is not a linear thing. You negotiate context, go back, negotiate again, go back, but the creative form help us negotiate those contexts.
Yeah, can I add to that? I mean, this is why art is so valuable in teaching. And I think Tim also said something about art being an invitation to enter into something else. And I'm using the book. These are the things that stay with us. I'm using that in my teaching right now. You sent me a PDF copy. I have shared it with my students, and I've asked them to choose four of these interviews and to respond to them on the basis of everything they've learned this term in my class. And, you know, in this class, they have read history books, and they have read documents like speeches and manifestos, the Freedom Charter, for instance, but they haven't heard the voices of ordinary people. And these voices of ordinary people are an invitation to try to step into their world. You know, it's very brief, but they can hear the voices on the website. They can read the text on the PDF. You know, they can step into that world. I use a lot of photography too. And photography is another invitation. With all the limitations that photography might have in terms of representation, it's nevertheless an invitation to imagine your way into a world, right? It's a window into a world. And if you accept that invitation, then it shows you things that you can't get any other way, right? You can't get it except through your eyes, you know, you can't get it except through the visual. And, you know, one of the things that I'm very grateful for about this invitation is that I did get a PDF copy of the book that I could share with my students, and it really has worked very, very well.
Well, I hope we can get you a hard copy as well as a PDF copy. And then that actually, in an organic way, brings us to the next question about using the arts in teaching and curriculum. And Tim Nkosi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, Caroline has touched upon it, John has spoken a little bit about it now, but we had a webinar last week on the intergenerational legacies of the slow violence of poverty. And one of the panelists then talked about this challenge of translating academic work into curricula that address our collected woundedness. And I was wondering if you could say something. What is your experience, or do you have any response to that question? How do we do it, and can it be done in your work with students? What are the barriers? What can we do if we want to translate academic work into curricula that address this woundedness?
You're really giving me a hard time. This invitation is a beautiful exercise. Let me think quickly as I'm thinking, because I didn't see that coming. You know, I mean, it depends. You know, context matter. I think all teachers, educators, so to speak, it is always important to study or to pay attention to the context in which we are teaching, to pay attention to the constituency that we are serving as educators. Because we have a tendency of reading books and designing curriculum that doesn't, you know, I mean, take into account the kind of constituency in terms of the generation that we are dealing with. Because, you know, I mean, 90s, pre-90s, that is 80s, 70s, 60s, going back, and the kind of students we are having are different. I know with my own experience as a high school, you know, person in the 80s, and also as a university student in the 90s, and things have changed. We're dealing with different students. So it becomes important to pay attention first to the kind of generation we are looking at, because it is not only the kind of technology, that influences them, the kind of the massive information that is bombarded, the competing, things that students are dealing with from the social media, television, at home and all of that. Because that helps them to ask, what kind of curriculum are we looking at? When students were asking for the decolonial or decolonized curriculum, I think they were asking us to think about these things. As much as Africa was central to Africanize, for me, it was also to say, how do we begin to address the contextual issues, the issues of our time, even if we trace back historical issues? That would be one advice, to say, let's design courses based on the kind of context that we have studied. Also, when we pay attention to the kind of constituents we are serving, the kind of students we are serving, but also you should be asking what kind of student we want to bring, as the next generation, So that should be the beginning point, instead of always depending on what we know and imposing on students. That would be, we need just to slow down to think in that way. So in terms of the courses I teach or the work, I try also to teach in open ways. By that I mean, the word academy or academia, it has this intimidating, sense. And of course, some people take pride because we work hard to earn these degrees. And some, they impose it, these kind of titles. And they deserve it because they work hard. They deserve to. But sometimes this title, they tend to stifle the way in which the context we are teaching is supposed to be. I believe in when people talk about open access, or, we need to begin to work with that. Students should be feeling free to reach us, to ask any question in a context of teaching, to ask the most stupid question so that we help them to think with us. At the very same time, they help us to understand things that we don't know. As an educator, one of the things I do when I enter class, I'm a learner. I prepared, but I know that these students, they're already advanced. While we are teaching, they're on their phone, Googling things you're talking about. And you cannot take that for granted, right? So in other words, you need to look at the context in which the teaching takes place to answer to just as a beginning. But also, is not to reduce the quality of academic work. We need to maintain that. I don't believe in standard. I'll speak of quality. Quality as in substance. Quality as in things that we do that matter. Substance matter. Substance is not quantity. It's an impact that we give to students. The choices we make as to what it is that we want to take in that classroom. And one of the things I remember, when you look at the politician campaigning, I always enjoy those politicians who have these simple slogans because they reach quickly their audience. Once you complicate it, you alienate people. So in other words, we don't need to water down a language or to reduce it. We need to find ways of writing or speaking of complex issues in a very kind of understandable way instead of hiding behind jargon. That's one of the problems with academics. And the best academics, I'll give one example without outsing people. One of the things I enjoy about Edward Said or even Mohamed Momdani, they write basically, beautiful, simply, and that they deal with complex issues that you don't need to have a dictionary or to be cramming a theory to understand them, right? And that kind of writing, it doesn't take substance away, it doesn't take quality away, it doesn't take the sophistication away, but what it does, it complicates what we mean by quality and complexity. That's what I think as learners we need to begin. And the question of theory rests in that, where we take this assumption, we break them down so that students can understand us and they can feel easily to reach us. The more students feel easy to question, the better for me education. That's my ethos, that's my methodology. When I preach to students, there are no questions, I feel I'm more concerned, right? So I'm trying to address the question of curriculum. So these are just like methodological issues I'm talking about. Of course, in terms of content and many other things, we also need to begin, for those who are teaching in arts. One of the things we do, we speak on behalf of artists all the time, even when we are alive with an opportunity. Perhaps I'm just also trying to respond to some of the questions that are posed in the chat. I do think we need to bring artists into our classroom so that they can speak to students directly, they can interact. We need to design teaching courses, teaching practices that we don't speak on behalf of living artists. When we have access to them, we have to create an interface where artists come in. They teach part of what we do. They run workshops, students they can interact. Because one of the things when we spend time with artists, and John Shaw will speak to this, even Caroline, is that artists are not bothered by the theory we're always so overwhelmed by. Artists, what they want to do is to reach you emotionally, psychologically, bodily. They want to move you with their work. And even when they talk about it, they have a particular way of talking. That is understandable. Just attend to walkabouts or visit them in their studio. Create a condition for them to speak. They open up these worlds I'm talking about, these avenues, right? So I do think, while we are thinking of curriculum, it should not be us being mediators or custodian. We should also rethink the form of teaching to bring artists into our classroom, to insist to the authorities that I'm teaching in Grahamstown. There are artists who are living here. How about designing a course whereby they are also part? They are not service to the course, but they are central. I think that's where, for me, then we'll be talking about what we call it, this kind of interface. We are talking about community engagement, social engagement, social cohesion. These theories need to be put in practice. That would be my initial response. The last comment I'll make is also to say, again, with the technology, if we are not able to bring artists into class, and thanks to COVID, not because of the traumatizing experiences give us, to force us to understand the power of using technology, we can always bring artists into our class now via these forms of Zoom, this form of WhatsApp, this form of Facebook, and all of these media that we have learned that we can teach while we are staying at home. So now there's no excuse to say the artist, we don't have money to bring him or her into class, but we can begin to create avenues so that students can also, in other words, we need to think of ourselves as educators as interface. And then this extend exactly to what I think the book does to some extent in its way of allowing those who were living in those like spaces that they were moved, forcibly removed from the center of anonymous, the center of happenings. They were forced out of the city to the slums, to the ghettos, to the township, right? So once you ask yourself, how then do we reorganize this space of interface to bring even the most remote people? And then in that way, we'll be able to reach what also Karen was talking about, this everyday experience, because artists live the everyday. They live the everyday. To walk, go to the studio, or to use your own space as a studio is an everyday. It's not something that is exclusive. I do it once in a while. It's a life for most people, for most artists. So what I'm saying is we need to rethink or think carefully about what we mean by the everyday, so that we are not reducing, we are not taking anything of substance and quality, but instead we are taking what we call academic scholarship to the people, so that it can also be claimed by the people. I know I'm speaking in abstract terms, because it's a very complex question. I'll ask my colleague to help me if I didn't manage to address your question, Mariana.
Thank you very much, Temuku. I think you said very important things there. I think we have about just more than 15 minutes left. And I don't want to make a presumption on behalf of Caroline and John that you have said something about the last question, which was about using art in teaching and teaching history through the arts. I wonder if you wanted something to add at this point, or I see there are questions about forgive me that I'm looking at the questions and answer. There's a question about how to bring art as a creating space for dialogue to high schools in South Africa through difficult history, trauma that language cannot reach. So there's a question with, about, I'm not articulating the question very well. And then there's a question about, this is very informative and fruitful. I would just like to know if art as a discipline encourages cross-cultural or intercontinental collaborations with the aim to expand the creative process within art itself. Secondly, I believe art is a very important discipline which can enhance the way we portray our lives, history, and the spaces around us. I wonder why art is not a compulsory subject for schools in South Africa. So there are two questions about schools and education and history and teaching, and I would wonder if any one of you would want to respond to that.
Well, let me try the first one. So I think the book, these are the things that stay with us. And the website would be useful for teaching even high school students, right? Because they are both very accessible. That you've got the interviews, which are in fact short interviews. They're not long interviews. So they're short interviews. They're in 3 languages. They are accompanied by just enough sort of contextualizing material that students can work with their teachers to sort of understand fully. Plus you've got the art. And I think that the combination of the website and the book itself would be a terrific way into the experience of apartheid, the everyday experience of apartheid for high school students. I do have to say, of course, that necessarily the book is concerned with trauma. And so the book is concerned especially with loss and with pain and with suffering. And, you know, we're talking about art and thinking about how art can help us see other things. And, you know, I spent 4 years as a member of the Pennsylvanians Carnival troupe in Hanover Park. And if we expand our idea of art, I would be happy to make an argument that Carnival is art, and that it's art that's produced by the working class. And it's art that's produced by the working class as a way of coping with historical trauma, as a way of coping with the legacy of slavery. They're very explicit about that. And we know that the roots of Carnival go all the way back to the end of slavery in the 1830s. And we know also that Carnival is about coping with apartheid, and Carnival is especially about coping with the forced removals. Because if you think about what happens on the 2nd of January, right, the Tweede Nuwe Jaar, what happens is that the dispossessed and the descendants of the dispossessed come from the Cape Flats, and what do? They reoccupy Cape Town. They take over Cape Town. And, you know, there are all kinds of responses to trauma, as we know. And some of them are quite negative in people's lives, but some of them are quite positive and creative. So I certainly see the Carnival as both a creative response to historical and contemporary trauma, but also as art. And I think it should be appreciated as art, and appreciated as art that has always been from within the working class, always controlled by the working class, never captured by the state, never captured by the affluent, never captured by corporations. It's still, as you know, unruly, right? Ungovernable. And that's part of the beauty of it.
Thank you, John. And the costumes itself is also art. Temunkosi, Caroline, did you want to add something? And while they are, I'm just wondering if Unison could draw my attention if there's anything that I've missed, if there's a question that I've missed, or if there is someone who wanted to come on live, or yeah, if there's anything I've missed. In the meantime, Caroline or Temunkosi, anything you wanted to add?
I'm very much in agreement with I think Temunkosi, you raised key points with regard to how one can use or think of a curriculum to engage these kind of issues. The idea of collaboration, of stepping outside of the academic structure into whether it's just like this collaboration we did, it was still institutional, but it was across kind of formal disciplines, if one could put it that way, but also stepping outside the institutional structures and engaging with other people, other organizations, bringing that into the curriculum as much as possible, I think is crucial to start engaging with the everyday, to use the term that has surfaced quite a lot today. And then responding to the question that was asked in the chat about why is art not a compulsory subject for schools, I think that's a good question, but I would also want to add, how could one use art in other subjects in schools in a way to further, I guess, challenge the more kind of siloed way of thinking of different disciplines and subjects, and that then links back to the idea of using the mind and the body to not just think of things and to start thinking, and this links back to Professor Mason's comment just now about, but what is art then? Many things is art. I think most people, and to what you said, Temunkosi, about we tend to think of it just as what's in a gallery, but it's so much more. And I think perhaps it could be worth exploring or actively working towards using art and design in other things as a way of almost resisting the dominant structures that we're used to, and trying to challenge that almost from within itself, if I can put it that way. Just a thought.
And maybe I can just quickly add there that I can't remember the exact quote, but one of the students said in the interviews that through this project, she felt that she had history at school, and that taught her very little, and that she never had history at university, but she learned most of what she knows about history at university. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at how we learn and what we learn and when we learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that too, yeah.
Temunkosi, anything you wanted to add to that? Or did you, if you saw a question that I missed on in the question and answer thread?
Thanks, Marika. I'll add just two things. One is, in what John was saying, and also in what Caroline was saying, to add and say, it is important to make art something that is fun, is playful, is joyful. In particular when we are dealing with issues such as trauma, especially in a context where, we know that one of the things the government failed dismally to do when they set up the TRC was to put, trauma counseling centers for those who went to listen to the stories of their loss, to their relatives that disappeared, to their loved ones that disappeared during the high time of apartheid, violence. So there we are, TRC, a spectacle on TV, and then were there trauma centers, counseling, psychological therapy? No, there were no institutionalized support for those who were forced again to recount and extend the trauma that they've suffered during apartheid, right? So to open up these stories and teach or deal with these stories, you know what I mean, it becomes important, you know what I mean, to devise ways in which you also lift people off, you know, to take flight, not as an escape. You know what I mean? One of the things art does, you know what I mean, once you are off the ground, then you are able to float. While you are floating, you're able at least to have a moment of relief so that you can think, you can deal. When we are grounded, sometimes you're clouded. And when we are clouded, you cannot see. And then you cannot get out. That's what part of therapy does. You know, whether it's a psychiatrist or psychologists and others, you know, I mean, they said release, relax, you know, take out, right? So that you'll be able to deal with it. So in other words, that component we call playfulness, it becomes important because in play, we release, right? When we have fun, when we play, when we have joy, we lighten up. That's why jokes are important. If I want to tell you some little crap, Marika, I need to joke, or let's go and have fun. And then I can tell you that I've been having, you know, for a long time. And art does that very well. Satire, you know, irony, and so forth. And we need to cultivate those areas. They are all tradition in the arts. As John have said, you'll find those kind of strategies of subversion in things that, in places that, in ways in which people have always, whether in traditional society, in indigenous societies, in many other forms, whereby, you know what I mean, that's why in South Africa, when you look at not only take the Coon Festival, it's a mocking. At the same time, it's a reclaiming of space. You learn about Imbongi, the praise singers, when the chief or the king, they will mock him or her, the queen, so that they will say something in this praise poem that people will be laughing, but the message is communicated. These are forms of performatives. These are forms of playfulness. These are forms of joy. So what I'm asking us to think about is also to recuperate or to rethink and integrate these strategies in our teaching, as well as in our practice, in particular when we are dealing with traumatic experiences and discourses. That will be my last, second last comment. The last one, you know, I mean, let's destroy this idea of art. Let's find another way of understanding how creativity works. You know, creativity works. Because for some, you know, once you talk about art, it locks, they look up to, they look at. You know what I mean? Once it becomes part of the ritual, once it becomes part of the everyday, it becomes a practice, they feel they are part of it, they can own it. Because they do it every day. You know what I mean? You'll find ordinary people, for example, you know, reorganizing their furniture, their homes every December. Whether they do spring cleaning, they remove furniture. If you think about that, that's a curating of the living space. People, they mend their gardens, they trim their flowers, but that not is seen as a creativity, because creativity is assigned to this exclusive, you know, form of elitism, such as art, whereas these are the everyday. I think this is what, if I understand John well, when you are saying, when you see those masquerades, those marching, these are everyday, even if now they are staged, and people do art every day. We do art. When you wake up, you make up yourself. When you dress yourself, that's a form of creativity. You go out, you know, I mean, the way you present yourself. You can even quote the best thinkers. And Foucault talks about it nicely when he said the self-styling, when he talks about self-care. What is that if it's not art? And this has been always there, and we do it every day. Few people leave their house without looking themselves on the mirror and see, am I looking well? Even we did prepare ourselves to appear on this kind of webinar. That is art in action, is practical. So when art becomes praxis, not like an aesthetic domain that is exclusive, I think then everyone can have a claim on it. So in other words, that's what I'm saying, let's destroy this notion of elitism, you know what I mean, of art. Let's open art to everyone, as much as we nurture the domain of teaching it, intellectualizing it, academizing, but let's also open it up. Because to do so, is to nurture for its long term. That will be my last comment, Marika. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim Nkosi. I think that sounds like such a wonderful notion to leave with, is that if art is part of our everyday, if you think about art also as something, that last look in the mirror in the morning as, what do I look like? That then it opens up so many more possibilities for engagement and indeed disengagement through the arts, but to think in a reflective way about what artistic engage, or what it means to be artistically engaged, and what it means to be engaged in social justice issues. And yeah, I think that's very thought-provoking. And I think this is also a good way perhaps to end, and maybe one last word to first you, Caroline, and then John.
Yeah, thank you, Marietjie, for the opportunity to be part of the discussion. I think there have been many thought-provoking things which will mull around in my mind over the next few days or so. But I think the potential of the broad, very broad, everyday scope and field of the arts to provide time and space for us to engage with things that are difficult to engage with in whatever kind of way. I would say that for me, yeah, to allow time to engage in that process and to become conscious thereof, I think is a take home for me from today's discussion. Yeah, so thank you.
John?
I just want to say thank you to Caroline and Tim Nkosi. This has been really very engaging, and I learned a lot from both of you. It's these conversations are really terrific, and here in the United States, many of us are self-isolating, and it is a real joy to have this kind of conversation. So thank you, Marietjie, for bringing me in. And that's all I want to say. Thank you to everybody for coming as well.
Tim Nkosi?
Same. Thank you, Marika, for the invitation. Thank you, John, for the conversation. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you also, Unison, for the technical facilitation. And again, thank you to the audience. And I see that Tebucho Sipanya seems to be disappointed, but this is part of how this discussion always tend to be. They cannot satisfy everyone, but for me, it was just a joy and one of those fountains from which I drank a lot today. So thank you.
Well, I want to thank the three of you, and thank you, Unison, as well, for all your assistance and for your work. I know a webinar like this is not without its stress, and it takes time. And thank you very much for your willingness to be in conversation with us this afternoon. With us, I'm not talking of myself as the royal we, I'm talking about us as studies in historical trauma and transformation. It was a joy to be the facilitator of this conversation, and I do hope that we will be able to invite you again, and maybe a next time face to face. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot.